The quill felt heavier than a broadsword. A simple raven feather, dipped in my own freshly drawn blood, hovering above the ancient, fragile parchment of the pack registry. One drop of crimson fell from the tip. It stained the yellowed paper. A permanent, irreversible blot. I pressed the sharpened edge to the dotted line beneath Ronan's name. The Alpha King. My fated mate. The man who had stood on a pristine marble balcony in another life. His scent a suffocating cloud of dark cedar and ozone, watching in absolute, paralyzed silence as a rogue army tore my throat out. I survived that bitter life only to wake up exactly 1 year in the past. To this exact room. To this choice, the registry master shifted his weight in the shadows. His breath hitched sharply in his throat. The stench of his nervous, sour sweat mixed with the dusty, stagnant air of the underground archives. He dared not speak. He dared not breathe too loudly. No one dared to question the reigning Luna. But I was not the Luna anymore. I dragged the bloodied quill across the paper. The first syllable of my name severed the shallow surface of the mate bond. A sharp, blinding crack echoed behind my ribs. My lungs seized. The phantom sensation of massive, jagged claws ripping through my chest stole every ounce of oxygen from the room. I gripped the edge of the heavy oak desk. The wood splintered under the crushing force of my raw fingertips. I forced my hand to steady. I forced the quill to move. The second syllable, a violent, agonizing shudder tore through my spine. The golden, thrumming tether that connected my soul to Ronan snapped. It did not fade. It did not slowly fray over time. It shattered like a frozen lake crushed under an iron anvil. My scent, once a warm, welcoming, blooming field of lavender, instantly calcified. Frost coated the edges of my aura. The lavender withered into cold, bitter ash and an unreachable, freezing silence. The gaping hole in my chest hollowed out completely, leaving a cavernous, echoing void where the warmth of my mate used to reside. The numbness was a mercy. I dropped the quill. It clattered against the solid wood. It was done. I was legally, biologically, and spiritually demoted. A scullery omega. A ghost in my own home. I turned my back on the pale registry master. The iron-wrought doors of the archives loomed ahead, heavy and unforgiving. Before I push these heavy doors open and step into the freezing shadows of my new, loveless reality, I need to know who is standing with me in the dark. Which country are you listening from? Comment below. I wrapped my trembling hands in the coarse, rough fabric of my gray spun dress. A maid's dress. The cold stone floor seeped through the thin soles of my worn leather shoes. A sudden, terrifying vibration rattled the ancient stone beneath my feet. A furious, deafening, world-shaking roar tore through the distant upper levels of the castle. He felt it. The walls of the underground corridor trembled violently against my palms. Dust rained down from the arched ceiling, coating my hair in a fine, powdery gray. Another roar ripped through the distant rafters of the king's estate. A sound of pure, unadulterated territorial panic. A sound I had waited a lifetime to hear, only to realize I no longer possessed the capacity to care. I closed my eyes. The shaking stone beneath my thin leather shoes dissolved. The chilling dampness of the registry basement vanished, replaced instantly by the suffocating, coppery stench of a massacre. The memory did not gently wash over me. It struck like a physical blow. The sky was burning. A sickly, twisted shade of bruised violet and bleeding crimson. The screams of the pack echoed in my ears, bouncing off the fortified walls of the courtyard. The very same pack that had spent years spitting at my feet, mocking my quiet nature, whispering cruelties behind hands reeking of superiority. They were dying. The border had fallen. The rogue army poured over the shattered iron gates like a tide of black, matted fur and yellow eyes. The stench of their rabid bloodlust was a physical pressure, crushing the oxygen from the courtyard. I stood in the center of the slaughter. I wore silk that day, a ridiculous, sweeping gown of pale gold, a Luna's garment, utterly useless in a war. The ground beneath me was slick with mud and the ruined bodies of our warriors. The terror of the Omegas huddled in the great hall struck me in waves. My biology demanded action. A hidden, lethal mechanism buried deep within the genetic code of my lineage. The empathic shielding scent. It was not a mystical power. It was a brutal, biological sacrifice. A failsafe designed to preserve the pack at the absolute cost of the Omega. My glands flared open. My scent, once a gentle lavender, mutated. It became a supermassive, invisible sinkhole. I inhaled sharply, filling my lungs with the poisoned air, and threw my aura outward. I felt the exact moment my scent latched onto the nervous systems of the rabid rogue. I dragged their bloodlust into my own bloodstream. I pulled the blinding terror of the fleeing pups into my chest. I absorbed the agonizing, white-hot pain of the dying warriors, I took it all. My nervous system ignited. It was 100 lightning bolts surging through fragile glass veins. My knees slammed into the bloody mud. The silk dress soaked up the carnage, turning a heavy, saturated red. The sheer volume of negative emotion overloaded my synapses. Blood poured freely from my nose, dripping down my chin in thick, warm streams. My vision blurred into a chaotic smear of violent colors. The rogues slowed, their rabid frenzy instantly neutralized by the paralyzing shock of my empathic weight. The pack was spared. I was dying. My organs were shutting down. The pressure inside my skull threatened to fracture bone. I dragged my heavy, blood-soaked head upward. I fought through the blinding haze of my own destruction to find him. My alpha, my mate, my protector. He stood on the pristine, white marble balcony of the royal suite. High above the filth, high above the blood, high above me, Ronan, his dark hair whipped in the violent, ash-choked wind. His massive frame was perfectly still. His scent drifted down to me through the slaughter. Dark cedar and ozone. It was utterly calm. There was no panic in his aroma. There was no desperate urgency. There was only the thick, heavy stench of arrogant assumption. He assumed I was safe. He assumed my devotion was a boundless well he could draw from without ever pouring anything back. He assumed I would simply survive because I always had. He did not shift. He did not jump from the balcony to rip the remaining rogues apart. He simply rested his large hands on the marble balustrade and watched. A rogue, confused but still driven by instinct, recovered faster than the rest. A massive, scarred wolf with half an ear missing and teeth yellowed with decay. I heard the wet, heavy thud of its paws charging through the mud. I could not move. My limbs were paralyzed, flooded with the toxic byproduct of my shielding scent. I looked up at Ronan one last time. Our eyes met. The rogue hit my back. The sheer force of the impact snapped my spine. The horrific, wet crunch echoed perfectly in the sudden, eerie silence of the courtyard. Jagged, filthy teeth clamped around my throat. The pain was absolute. It tore through my remaining consciousness like a jagged blade. I choked on my own blood. My final breath was a gargled, suffocating gasp. And still Ronan stood on the balcony. He did not scream. He did not break. He watched my life extinguish, a permanent statue carved from apathy and cedar. The metallic taste of my own blood coated the back of my tongue. I jolted forward, my eyes snapping open to the suffocating darkness of the present-day basement. The memory tore itself away, leaving me gasping for air against the cold, unyielding stone of the corridor. My hands flew to my throat. There was no blood. There was no gaping wound. Only the smooth, unblemished skin of a second chance. The frantic pounding of my heart slowly regulated. The panic drained away, replaced by the deep, freezing hollow where my mate Bond used to reside. The lavender scent around me remained utterly dead. Frostbitten ash. I pressed my back against the wall, absorbing the chill of the underground. I was alive. I was exactly 1 year away from that muddy courtyard. I would never wear gold silk again. I would never bleed out for a mate who viewed me as architecture. A heavy, purposeful footstep echoed at the top of the grand staircase above. A low, terrifying growl rattled the wooden door leading down to the servants' quarters. The king was awake, and he was hunting. The wooden door leading to the servant quarters groaned in protest as I pushed it open. It was a heavy, rusted sound that perfectly matched the hollow ache in my chest. The air down here was thick. It tasted of old dampness, crushed limestone, and the lingering, sour exhaustion of the lower caste omegas. I welcomed it. It was real. It was honest. Unlike the suffocating perfume of the royal suite upstairs, this air did not lie. I descended the narrow, spiraling stone staircase. With every step downward, the phantom weight of the Luna crown slipped further from my skull. My soft leather shoes slapped quietly against the wet stone. Down. Further down. Away from the vaulted ceilings painted with lies and the velvet drapery that hid the rotting core of this pack. I reached the bottom landing. A long, lightless corridor stretched out before me, lined with identical, heavy wooden doors. The scullery dormitories. I walked past the rooms of the cooks, the launderers, and the stable hands. I reached the very last door at the end of the hall. Room 44. The lowest station in the castle hierarchy. The basement of the basement. I pushed the door open. There were no windows here. No gentle morning light to wake me. Only a single, flickering tallow candle resting on a splintered wooden stool, casting long, distorted shadows against the weeping stone walls. A narrow cot occupied the far corner. A thin, scratchy woolen blanket lay folded at the foot of a lumpy mattress. A rusted iron basin stood in the opposite corner, a coarse brick of lye soap resting beside it. It was perfection. I stripped off the gray spun dress I had worn to the registry. I let it pool around my ankles, stepping out of the last remnant of my transition. Hanging on a peg on the back of the door was my new uniform. The scullery rag. The fabric was brutal. It was unbleached, undyed linen, stiff and abrasive against my skin. I pulled it over my head. The rough collar scratched violently against my collarbone. It was a grounding sensation, a constant, physical reminder that I was no longer untouchable. I tied the thick canvas apron around my waist, pulling the strings tight. The rough knot dug into my spine. I was a blank slate, an empty vessel. Beneath the abrasive fabric, deep within my cellular structure, my biological gift hummed. The empathic shielding scent. Without the parasitic drain of the mate bond pulling at my reserves, the energy within me felt entirely different. In my past life, the gift had been a constant, agonizing drain, a bleeding wound that the pack unconsciously fed upon. Whenever an alpha threw a tantrum, whenever a warrior experienced night terrors, my biology had automatically extended a soothing, invisible hand, draining my own vitality to calm their frayed nerves. I had spent years existing in a state of perpetual, exhausting anemia. Now the tether was severed. The outbound flow of my energy was violently clamped shut. The shielding power pooled deep in my chest. It felt heavy. It felt like a dormant, coiled serpent resting just beneath my ribcage. It hummed with a low, vibrating frequency. It was a cold, dense mass of hoarded survival. If I concentrated, I could feel the microscopic receptors in my olfactory glands snapping shut, refusing to absorb the ambient stress of the castle. My aura was locked behind an impenetrable wall of frost. The scent of cold, dead lavender wrapped tightly around my skin, refusing to extend even an inch beyond my physical body. I was a closed circuit. The hum was steady, rhythmic, comforting in its utter isolation. I walked over to the rusted iron basin. A heavy wooden bucket sat beside it, filled to the brim with freezing water drawn from the underground well. I plunged my bare hands into the bucket. The cold was instantaneous and savage. It felt like 1,000 tiny needles piercing the skin of my fingers, driving straight into the bone. I did not flinch. I did not pull away. I welcomed the biting agony. It proved my nervous system was still functioning. It proved the numbness in my soul had not entirely paralyzed my body. I grabbed the heavy block of lye soap. It felt like pumice stone against my palms. I dunked it into the freezing water. I picked up the thick, bristled scrub brush resting on the floor. I knelt on the unforgiving stone. The dampness immediately seeped through the knees of my coarse skirt, chilling my joints. I dragged the wet soap across the stiff bristles of the brush. A thin, gray lather began to form. It was not the sweet, fragrant foam of the royal baths. It was harsh. It smelled of chemicals and raw earth. I leaned forward, pressing my weight onto the brush, and drove it into the dirty stone floor. Back and forth. The rhythmic, scratching sound of the bristles echoed loudly in the small, stone room. Scrape. 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 Short, sharp, violent motions. I focused entirely on the square foot of stone beneath me. I watched the gray water pool in the shallow grooves of the rock, trapping the dirt and grime. I scrubbed harder. The rough wooden handle of the brush rubbed mercilessly against the tender skin between my thumb and forefinger. A blister began to form within minutes. I ignored it. I pressed harder. The gray water splashed against my wrists. It was freezing. It was real. Suddenly, the rhythmic scratching of my brush was interrupted. A massive, heavy impact slammed against the stone ceiling directly above my head. The floorboards of the main level were thick, but the sheer force of the blow sent a shower of fine dust raining down onto my wet hands. He was tearing the upper levels apart. The frantic, heavy thud of large boots pacing back and forth rattled the tallow candle on my stool. Then the scent hit me. It seeped through the cracks in the masonry, drifting down through the floorboards like a poisonous gas. Dark cedar and ozone. But it was completely wrong. The arrogant, suffocating calmness that usually defined his aroma was gone. The scent was erratic. It was sharp. It smelled of burnt wood, static electricity, and a sickening coppery edge of rising panic. It was the scent of a predator that had returned to its den to find it completely empty. Ronan was searching for me. I stared at the puddle of gray, dirty water spreading across the floor. The cedar scent grew thicker, choking the stale air of my basement room. The heavy footsteps above stopped abruptly. Right above my head, a tense, suffocating silence fell over the castle. He was listening. He was trying to find my heartbeat. He was trying to locate the warm, blooming lavender that no longer existed. I did not hold my breath. I did not freeze in terror. I simply adjusted my grip on the wooden handle. The blister on my hand tore open with a sharp, stinging tear. I drove the brush back into the wet stone. Scrape, scrape, scrape. The harsh, coarse sound echoed upward, slicing through the dead silence like a blade. A clear, unmistakable beacon in the dark. I heard the splintering crack of floorboards above as a massive weight suddenly lunged toward the stairwell. The heavy, iron-reinforced oak doors of the Luna suite crashed open 3 floors above me. The acoustic resonance of the ancient keep carried the violence of the impact down the stone shafts, vibrating directly into the marrow of my bones. I kept my head down. My raw, bleeding knuckles plunged back into the bucket of freezing, gray water. I knew exactly what Ronan was doing. I could track his every movement through the acute, hypersensitive hearing of an Omega and the downdraft of the castle's ventilation shafts. He stepped over the threshold. A prolonged, agonizing silence followed the crash of the doors. He was standing perfectly still in the center of the vast, sunlit bedroom. I knew exactly what he was looking at. I had left it meticulously arranged. The enormous, gilded vanity mirror reflected the massive 4-poster bed. Resting perfectly in the dead center of the silk mattress was my Luna crown. Next to it, meticulously folded into a neat, lifeless square, was the pale gold silk dress. The same dress I had died in. The same dress he had watched bleed out into the mud. He was staring at it. I scrubbed the coarse brush against the rough limestone floor. Scrape, scrape, scrape. The blister on my thumb wept a thin stream of clear fluid, stinging bitterly as the lye soap bit into the raw flesh. I welcomed the sting. It kept me grounded in the damp basement, far away from the suffocating luxury of the suite above. Upstairs, Ronan took a deep, commanding breath. He was searching for me, his massive chest expanding, drawing in the air of the room, expecting to fill his lungs with the warm, blooming, subservient scent of my lavender. He expected the soft, comforting aroma of a mate who was always waiting, always forgiving, always pliant. He inhaled nothing. The sudden, violently sharp shift in the atmospheric pressure made my ears pop. The scent rolling down the stone vents changed instantly. The arrogant, smooth dark cedar and ozone curdled. It mutated into the harsh, choking stench of burnt wood and sharp, metallic panic. He realized I was gone. The absolute, freezing void of my severed bond finally registered in his arrogant mind. It wasn't a fade. It was a surgical amputation. A deafening, terrifying roar of pure, feral rage shook the ceiling. The floorboards above me groaned under the sudden, explosive shift of his massive weight. The sound of shattering glass cascaded down the walls. He had thrown something massive, perhaps the solid oak armchair, directly through the gilded vanity mirror. I heard the heavy, velvet drapery being ripped violently from the iron rods. He was tearing the suite apart. He was tearing apart the closets, throwing my remaining silk gowns to the floor, hunting for a shadow. He thought this was a game. He thought this was a manipulation. The scent of his burnt wood fury carried the undeniable, arrogant subtext of a predator dealing with a misbehaving pet. He assumed I was hiding in a corner, throwing a pathetic, dramatic tantrum to force his attention. He believed I had hidden myself away just so he could find me, so he could drag me out by the wrist and demand I stop being ridiculous. He believed his sheer alpha presence could bully the mate bond back into existence. He was so incredibly wrong. The destruction upstairs ceased. Another heavy silence fell. He was standing amidst the ruin of the Luna suite, his chest heaving, his burnt cedar scent thick with confusion. Then he found the trail. My scent had not vanished entirely from the castle. It had just died. The path from the Luna suite, down the grand, sweeping marble staircase, and into the servants' bowels was marked by a faint, lingering trail of frost-bitten ash and dead lavender. It was the scent of a ghost. The frantic, heavy thud of his boots resumed. He was no longer walking. He was stalking. He descended the grand staircase, his footfalls hitting the marble like hammer strikes. Boom, boom, boom. The pace was entirely erratic. It lacked the smooth, measured, terrifying grace of the Alpha King. It was the frantic, desperate scramble of a man whose reality was rapidly fracturing. He hit the main floor. The terrified whimpers of the castle staff echoed through the vents as they pressed themselves against the stone walls, desperately trying to avoid the wrath of the king. He ignored them. He did not issue a single command. He did not demand answers. He simply followed the ash, down the servants' corridor. The heavy wooden door at the top of the basement stairs groaned loudly as he ripped it off its iron hinges. It crashed down the stone steps, splintering into heavy, jagged shards against the landing. He was descending into the dark. He was descending into my world. The burnt cedar scent flooded the narrow, lightless hallway outside my room. The heavy, ragged sound of his breathing echoed off the weeping stone walls. He stopped right outside door 44. The wood of my door was thin, rotted at the bottom from years of dampness. I could see the massive, sweeping shadow of his boots blocking the sliver of light from the corridor. The doorknob rattled. He did not turn it. He simply gripped the brass handle, his sheer strength bending the metal inward. He was standing inches away, separated only by a rotting piece of wood, gathering his fury, preparing to command his submissive mate to kneel. I did not stop scrubbing. I plunged my bleeding hand back into the gray water. The freezing liquid soaked the rough canvas of my apron. I squeezed the dirty rag, the water splashing loudly against the stone. I kept my head down, my eyes fixed on the dirty floor. I waited for the wood to splinter. The thin rotting wood of door 44 exploded inward. It did not swing open. It shattered into 100 jagged splinters that rained down upon the damp limestone floor. The rusted brass hinges screamed as they were ripped completely from the stone frame. He stood in the ruined threshold. He was a colossal shadow eclipsing the meager light of the corridor. His massive chest heaved with the exertion of his unchecked fury. The scent of burnt cedar and frantic ozone rushed into my small, lightless cell. It suffocated the stale air. It was a physical pressure demanding submission. The heavy thud of his muddy boots stepped over the splintered wood. He expected me to cower. He expected me to scramble backward against the weeping stone wall and bare my throat in a desperate plea for forgiveness. He believed his sheer presence was enough to force the world back into its proper alignment. I did not stop scrubbing. Scrape, scrape, scrape. The harsh bristles of my wooden brush dug mercilessly into the wet stone. The dirty gray water splashed up against the hem of my coarse linen skirt. The stinging bite of the lye soap seeped into my raw knuckles. The pain was sharp and brilliantly clear. I dipped the dirty rag into the wooden bucket. The freezing water numbed a weeping blister on my thumb. I wrung the rag out. The steady splash of the dirty water echoed off the stone walls. It was the only sound in the room. He was waiting for my reaction. He was waiting for the tantrum. His shadow fell over my hunched shoulders. The ambient temperature of the room plummeted. The sheer suffocating weight of his alpha aura pressed down upon the back of my neck. In my past life, it would have driven me to my knees. It would have forced a whimper of absolute submission from my throat. It would have made my hands shake and my heart race with a desperate biological need to placate his anger. Now it felt like nothing more than a passing draft in a cold room. His breathing grew ragged. The violent, erratic rhythm of his lungs betrayed the panic simmering beneath his rage. The burnt cedar scent thickened into something rancid and metallic. The smell of fear. He stepped closer. The toe of his heavy leather boot entered the puddle of dirty gray water directly in front of my knees. I dragged my brush right up to the edge of his boot. I stopped. I did not look up at his face. I stared blankly at the mud caking the heavy leather. Stand up. The command was a physical shockwave. It boomed through the tiny basement room. It rattled the tallow candle on the splintered stool until the small flame flickered and died, plunging us entirely into the gray shadows of the corridor light. The absolute authority of the Alpha King. A sound designed to bend the will of every wolf within 10 miles. A sound that had always sent a jolt of terrifying subservience straight down my spine. The sound hit me. It washed over me. It completely dissolved into the frozen dead void where my mate Bond used to reside. Nothing happened. My heart rate did not spike. My hands did not tremble. My biological impulse to obey was gone. The command held absolutely no power over a ghost. I dropped the coarse wooden brush into the bucket. It sank into the murky freezing water with a dull heavy thud. I slowly wiped my raw wet hands on my thick canvas apron. I stood up. I did not stand because he commanded it. I stood because the floor in this corner was sufficiently clean and my knees were aching from the damp cold. I finally raised my head. Our eyes met. His pupils were blown wide with feral territorial aggression. The golden ring of his inner wolf bled into the dark iris, a violent storm of dominance and possessive rage. He was searching my face for the familiar terror. He was waiting for the tears to well up in my eyes. He was waiting for the frantic, desperate spark of a mate trying to explain herself. He found absolutely nothing. My gaze was a flat, freezing expanse of absolute nothingness. I looked at the man who had let me die. I felt no hatred. I felt no anger. I felt no sorrow. I simply felt nothing at all. I was a hollow shell looking at a stranger. The absolute complete indifference in my eyes struck him harder than a physical blow. The feral rage draining from his posture was instantaneous and shocking. His massive shoulders slumped as if invisible weights had been dropped upon them. The violent golden glow in his eyes snapped off, leaving behind only wide, dark human terror. A sudden wet, choked gasp tore its way up his throat. He stumbled backward. His heavy leather boot slipped violently on the wet stone floor. He caught his balance against the weeping stone wall, but his hand immediately flew to his chest. He clutched his massive pectoral muscles with violently shaking fingers. The severed bond was finally echoing back to him. The biological reality of my departure hit his nervous system. The physical agony of my absolute apathy was tearing into his heart muscle like jagged iron teeth. His face drained of all color in a single terrifying second. His lips parted in a silent scream of pure visceral chest pain. The mighty Alpha King looked exactly like a man drowning in completely dry air. He could not breathe. He could not comprehend the freezing void where my love used to be. I reached down and grabbed the heavy iron handle of my wooden bucket. I hoisted the freezing dirty gray water against my hip. I stepped around his trembling massive frame, as if he were nothing more than a piece of discarded broken furniture cluttering my workspace. The thick stiff canvas of my coarse apron brushed lightly against his fine dark trousers. He recoiled violently from the brief contact, as if my touch had burned right through the fabric and into his skin. He gasped again, a pathetic broken sound that echoed loudly in the damp room. I walked out into the corridor, heading toward the vast, noisy kitchens. I left him entirely alone in the dark. A single drop of dirty water fell from my heavy bucket, hitting the stone floor directly behind me with a sharp snapping sound. 3 weeks bled into one another, measured only by the agonizing friction of coarse bristles against merciless stone. The grand halls of the Alpha King were a sprawling labyrinth of pristine white marble and polished obsidian. They required constant, backbreaking labor to maintain their arrogant gleam. That labor was now entirely mine. I spent my days on my hands and knees, dragging my heavy wooden bucket from one towering corridor to the next. The thick canvas of my apron was perpetually soaked with freezing, dirty water. My hands, once soft and carefully manicured with sweet almond oil, were completely destroyed. The skin across my knuckles had split open, refusing to heal under the constant assault of harsh lye soap and biting cold. The blisters had popped, calloused, and cracked open again, leaving deep, weeping fissures in my flesh. Often, the dirty gray water in my bucket would take on a faint, sickly pink hue by the end of the day. I did not care. The stinging pain in my joints was a reliable, steady anchor. It kept the memories of my previous life buried deep beneath the immediate necessity of survival. The rest of the pack treated me like a walking plague. The proud warriors who used to openly scoff at my gentle nature now plastered themselves against the walls whenever I dragged my bucket past them. The vicious, gossiping Omegas who had once whispered cruelties behind my back now fled the corridors the moment they heard the rhythmic scraping of my brush. They were not afraid of me. I was nothing but a broken scullery made in coarse linen, smelling of lye and dead ash. They were terrified of the monstrous shadow that perpetually stalked my every waking moment. The entire social hierarchy of the castle was paralyzed by the bizarre, horrific spectacle of the king's descent into madness. Ronan was always there. He never approached me directly, but his presence was a heavy, suffocating blanket that draped over the grand halls. He hid in the dark alcoves beneath the sweeping staircases. He stood perfectly still behind the massive marble pillars, watching me work. His scent betrayed him long before my ears ever caught his uneven breathing, or my eyes caught his reflection in the polished armor lining the corridors. The dark cedar and ozone had completely rotted. The proud, dominating aroma of the Alpha King was gone, replaced by the sour, sickly stench of a dying animal. It smelled of wet ash, decaying wood, and a constant, agonizing hum of chronic physical illness. The severed mate bond was slowly starving him to death. A male wolf is biologically wired to draw emotional and psychological stability from his mate. By entirely cutting off my empathic feed, by sealing my soul behind an impenetrable wall of frost and dead lavender, I had severed his vital supply line. The psychological torment of my absolute indifference was manifesting as a violent, incurable wasting disease. The few times I caught his reflection in the tall glass windows, the physical deterioration was deeply shocking. The massive, immovable mountain of muscle and arrogance had withered. Deep, bruising purple bags hung heavily beneath his bloodshot, sunken eyes. His jawline was sharp and gaunt, protruding harshly against his ashen skin. His broad shoulders sloped forward, curved inward, as if he were constantly trying to physically hold together a gaping, bleeding wound in his chest. He was in constant, visceral agony. Every time I scrubbed the floor, every time I refused to acknowledge his presence, another invisible microfracture spiderwebbed across his ribcage. He wanted me to scream at him. He desperately needed me to hurl the dirty scrub water directly into his face, to curse his name, to demand bloody retribution for the apathetic cruelty he had shown me in the past. Anger was an emotion. Hatred was a connection. It would have been a tether he could desperately grab onto to pull himself out of the void. But I gave him absolutely nothing. I was a ghost haunting the floors of his kingdom, entirely oblivious to the man weeping silently in the shadows of his own home. The psychological warfare was entirely one-sided, yet it was completely destroying him from the inside out.
Welcome back to our channel. Today Mott V brought you a brand new and incredibly captivating story, sure to please you if we watch the whole video. This story is entirely fictional. The video was created using artificial intelligence AI and is designed to provide positive entertainment and educational value to viewers aged Muiba and up. Now let us continue exploring today's story.
I would spend hours scrubbing the massive entrance hall, acutely aware of his ragged, wet breathing echoing from the second-floor balcony. He would stand there for half the day, his large hands gripping the marble balustrade so tightly that the ancient stone began to crack and turn to dust under the crushing pressure. He was waiting for me to look up. He was begging the universe for a single, fleeting upward glance. He wanted to catch my eye, to see a tiny flicker of the old, warm lavender, to find a microscopic crack in the ice where he could force his unspoken apologies. I never lifted my chin. I kept my eyes fixed firmly on the dirty stone beneath my bleeding hands. The sound of my coarse brush scraping against the floor was the only answer he ever received. Scrape, scrape, scrape. A monotonous, unending drumbeat marching him relentlessly toward total insanity. Late one evening, the grand hall was plunged into deep, suffocating twilight. The massive iron chandeliers had not yet been lit by the staff, who were too terrified to enter the corridor while the king was lurking. I was finishing the final stretch of marble near the heavy, iron-wrought doors of the royal armory. The biting cold of the drafty corridor seeped deep into the marrow of my bones, stiffening my back. I plunged my ruined hands into the bucket to wring out the heavy, dirty rag. The deep fissure across my right index finger caught sharply on the stiff, rough canvas. A fresh, brilliant wave of pain shot up my arm, pulsing with my heartbeat. I pulled my hand from the freezing water, my fingers trembling slightly from the sheer exhaustion of a 14-hour shift. A single, heavy drop of bright crimson blood gathered at the very tip of my raw knuckle. It swelled for a fraction of a second, heavy and thick, before falling heavily toward the pristine white floor. It hit the polished marble with a soft, wet tap. Instantly a sharp, wet, choked gasp echoed from the pitch-black shadows of the armory doorway, followed immediately by the terrifying, metallic scrape of heavy claws violently gouging into the stone wall. The echo of my single drop of blood hitting the polished marble was impossibly loud. It shattered the heavy silence of the twilight corridor. The massive shadow lurking in the pitch-black archway of the royal armory detached itself from the darkness. He stepped out into the dim gray light. Ronan, the Alpha King. He looked like a creature dragged from the bottom of a frozen river. He had clearly spent the last 3 days tearing aimlessly through the perimeter woods in the middle of the torrential autumn storms. His heavy royal garments were completely ruined. Thick dark mud caked his trousers up to the knees. His dark hair was plastered to his forehead in wet matted strands. Rainwater and grime dripped from his broad shoulders. Pooling on the immaculate white stone I had just spent 3 hours scrubbing. The stench rolling off his massive frame was entirely suffocating. The dark cedar was completely drowned out by the harsh metallic tang of pure visceral panic and rotting ozone. It was the scent of an apex predator that had entirely lost its mind. His chest heaved with violent ragged gasps. Every breath sounded like tearing wet paper. He walked toward me. His heavy leather boots left massive thick clumps of dark, wet earth on the pristine marble. He did not say a word. He did not issue a command. He simply walked until he stood directly in the center of the corridor. He blocked my path entirely. He stood right in the middle of my clean floor. I did not raise my head to look at his ruined face. My eyes remained fixed on a downward angle. I stared at his boots. They were magnificent pieces of craftsmanship, deep rich black leather reinforced with heavy steel. But right now they were completely smothered in a thick heavy crust of wet forest mud and decaying autumn leaves. The mud was slowly sliding off the leather, dropping with heavy wet splats onto the gleaming white marble. My objective was very simple. My universe was entirely reduced to the parameters of my station. I was a scullery omega. My duty was the floor. The floor was dirty. I did not sigh. I did not glare up at him in defiance. I simply reached down and grabbed the heavy wooden handle of my bucket. I dragged the freezing dirty gray water closer to his feet. The metal bottom of the bucket scraped harshly against the stone. I shuffled forward on my bruised, aching knees. The freezing wet canvas of my apron dragged across the floor. I stopped when I was kneeling directly in front of his massive mud-caked boots. I plunged my bleeding raw hands back into the freezing water. The salt and lye bit viciously into the fresh cut on my knuckle. I ignored the stinging pulse. I pulled the heavy coarse rag from the bottom of the bucket. I wrung out the excess water. The dirty liquid splashed over my wrists. I leaned forward. I pressed the wet coarse rag directly against the toe of the Alpha King's boot. I began to scrub, back and forth. The stiff fibers of the rag dug into the thick heavy mud. Scrape. Wipe. The dark earth began to dissolve, smearing across the fine black leather before being absorbed into the gray fabric of my rag. I dipped the cloth back into the freezing bucket. I squeezed the dirty brown water out. I pressed the rag back to his boot. I moved to the heavy steel buckles. I worked with meticulous hollow precision. The blister on my thumb tore open wider. A fresh smear of my own bright red blood mixed with the wet forest mud, staining the side of his right boot. I simply wiped it away and kept scrubbing. I polished the leather until the dim twilight of the corridor reflected faintly in the clean steel. I was a completely broken, soulless automaton. Y pusasa no dignity. Y arburad no prida. I was perfectly content to kneel in the freezing dirt and wash the filth from the feet of the man who had let me die. A horrific, strangled sound shattered the silence above me. It was a noise I had never heard a male wolf make, let alone the most powerful alpha in the Western Hemisphere. It was a high, thin, keening wail of absolute psychological devastation. The sheer visual horror of my absolute submissive apathy finally broke the very foundation of his sanity. The proud, untouchable king watched his fated mate, a woman who should have been wearing gold silk and a diamond crown, mechanically scrubbing mud off his shoes with bleeding, ruined hands. His massive knees buckled entirely. Ronan collapsed. He dropped straight down, his massive weight hitting the floor with a heavy, bone-rattling thud. He did not kneel on the dry marble. He dropped directly into the puddle of freezing, dirty scrub water surrounding my bucket. The filthy gray liquid instantly soaked through his fine trousers. He did not care. He threw his massive, trembling hands forward. He did not reach for my waist. He did not reach for my face. He lunged directly for the filthy wet rag trapped between my raw fingers. His giant hands were shaking so violently that his heavy silver rings clattered against the handle of my bucket. He grabbed my wrists. His touch was burning hot, a desperate, frantic heat entirely opposite to the freezing void in my chest. He was trying to pry the coarse rag out of my grip. He was frantically trying to pull my bleeding fingers away from the harsh bristles and the dirty water. I tightened my grip on the rag. I had a job to do. I pulled my hands back against his chest to keep scrubbing the leather. The resistance broke him completely. He let out a loud, ugly, heaving sob. The sound tore its way out of his throat, completely devoid of any alpha control or dignity. Tears, thick and heavy, poured freely from his sunken bloodshot eyes. They tracked down his gaunt cheeks, mixing with the rain and grime on his face, falling rapidly into the dirty gray water between us. He bent his head down until his forehead touched my freezing, wet knuckles. He wept uncontrollably. His massive shoulders shook with the concussive force of his grief. He sobbed into my bleeding hands, entirely surrendering his crown, his pride, and his ego to the filthy puddle on the floor. His ragged breaths washed over my skin. The heavy scent of his rotting ozone and decaying cedar completely enveloped me. He was drowning. He was a dying man clinging desperately to a frozen corpse. I stopped scrubbing, not out of pity, not out of love, but simply because he was physically blocking my access to the rest of the mud. I let the dirty wet rag slip from my fingers. It dropped into the puddle with a soft splash. I left my raw hands resting limply in his frantic burning grip. I looked down at the top of his dark wet hair. A heavy drop of dirty gray water fell from the iron chandelier above us, landing directly on the back of his neck with a loud, hollow snap. The rusted iron bell of the servant quarters clanged violently, announcing the arrival of the false dawn. I rose from my lumpy, damp cot in the basement. My entire body felt like a single, solid block of bruised ice. My knees throbbed with a dull, rhythmic ache from kneeling in the freezing puddles of the grand hall. I wrapped the stiff, unbleached linen apron around my waist, pulling the heavy canvas strings tight against my spine. My hands were a landscape of absolute ruin. The skin across my knuckles was split, weeping clear fluid and thick dark blood. I ignored the throbbing pulse in my fingers. I walked out of my lightless room and ascended the spiraling stone stairs toward the main scullery supply closet. My objective was the western wing. The marble floors required polishing. I pushed the heavy oak door of the supply room open. I reached into the familiar darkness for my heavy wooden bucket and the block of harsh lye soap. My raw fingers grasped absolutely nothing but empty, stale air. I blinked into the dim gloom. The room was entirely hollowed out. Every single wooden bucket, every stiff bristled scrub brush, every coarse rag, and every block of chemical soap had vanished. The wooden shelves were stripped bare. The heavy iron hooks on the walls were empty. The air in the small room did not smell of damp earth and cleaning lye. It was completely suffocated by the heavy, thick stench of dark cedar and the frantic, metallic bite of rotting ozone. Ronan had been here. He had not slept. He had spent the midnight hours tearing through the bowels of his own castle like a starving, desperate wolf. I walked out into the vast, cavernous kitchens. The massive cast iron cauldrons used by the laundering omegas to boil the royal linens were tipped completely upside down. The heavy scouring stones were gone. The long wooden tables were entirely swept clean of any tool that could cause friction or pain. The castle staff stood huddled in the far corners of the kitchen, pressing their trembling bodies against the cold stone walls. Their eyes were wide with a silent, paralyzing terror. The Alpha King had not issued a single royal decree. He had not screamed. He had simply moved through the dark like a ghost, violently confiscating every piece of cleaning equipment in the entire estate. He believed he could stop the bleeding by removing the wood and the coarse hair. He thought if he took away the tools of my labor, he could somehow force my ruined hands to heal. He did not understand that the damage was not localized to my skin. The bleeding was entirely internal. The freezing void in my chest required constant motion to keep from swallowing me whole. A true Omega of the lowest caste does not require tools to fulfill her biological imperative to serve. If the floor is dirty, the floor must be cleaned. I walked slowly toward the massive, roaring hearth at the center of the kitchen. The heavy stones surrounding the fire were permanently coated in thick black grease, baked on soot, and the hardened ash of 1,000 meals. I had no bucket of freezing water. I had no coarse rag. I simply knelt on the hard floor. I reached out and pressed my bare, bleeding hands directly against the harsh, abrasive rock. I began to rub the soot away. The jagged, unforgiving surface of the stone bit instantly into my exposed flesh. The deep fissures on my palms tore open wider. Smears of bright, wet crimson immediately mixed with the thick black ash, staining the gray stones. Scrape. Scrape. The rough sound of my raw skin dragging against the rock echoed loudly in the terrifying silence of the kitchen. The ambient temperature in the room plummeted violently. The terrified, ragged breathing of the huddled cooks ceased entirely. A massive, looming shadow completely eclipsed the warm, orange glow of the roaring hearth. Ronan. The stench of his burnt, decaying cedar washed over my hunched shoulders. He did not roar my name. He did not rip me away from the stone with his immense strength. He simply dropped to his knees on the grease-stained floor directly beside me. His breathing was shallow, rapid, and completely devoid of any rhythmic control. He did not look at my blank, indifferent face. His bloodshot, sunken eyes were locked obsessively on my ruined, ash-covered fingers. His massive hands reached out toward me. He was clutching a thick spool of the finest, softest white silk bandages. It was material reserved exclusively for the royal guard, woven with healing salves that smelled faintly of sweet eucalyptus. He did not speak. The subtext of his silence was deafening. He was desperately, obsessively trying to fix the physical wounds because he was entirely powerless to touch the freezing void of my soul. His giant, battle-scarred hands trembled so violently that he nearly dropped the silk spool. He reached out and gently, so incredibly gently, took my right wrist. His skin was burning with a frantic, feverish heat that clashed violently against my absolute numbness. He began to wrap the pristine white silk around my bleeding knuckles. He moved with a heartbreaking, meticulous desperation. He smoothed the delicate fabric over the deepest, angriest cuts. His ragged breathing hitched and caught in his throat every time a fresh drop of my blood seeped through the pure white silk, staining it a sickening, bright red. He wrapped my left hand. He tucked the final piece of silk firmly into the fold. He sat back on his heels, his broad chest heaving. He stared intensely at my newly bound hands. He was waiting. He was begging the silent universe for a single, soft sigh of relief. He needed to believe he had provided comfort. I looked down at my hands. The white silk was beautifully soft. It was luxurious. It was completely useless for scrubbing grease. I placed my newly bandaged right hand firmly against the harsh, jagged edge of the hearthstone. I pressed my weight into my palm and dragged my hand violently across the rock. The delicate, expensive silk caught instantly on the sharp edges. It tore with a loud, distinct ripping sound. The black soot and my fresh blood immediately saturated the pristine fabric, ruining it entirely in a single devastating motion. I continued to rub the stone. Scrape. Scrape. A sharp, Terrifying crack echoed directly from the center of his chest, sounding exactly like a massive rib snapping perfectly in half under an unbearable, crushing weight. The midnight bell chimed, a hollow, mournful toll echoing through the upper spires. My shift was over. I descended into the absolute, suffocating darkness of the servants' bowels. My torn canvas apron was stiff with dried freezing water and thick black grease. The ruined white silk bandages, once a desperate plea for forgiveness, now clung to my bleeding knuckles in a tangled, hardened mess of soot and dried crimson blood. I did not peel them off. I simply let my ruined hands hang limply at my sides. I pushed open the shattered remnants of door 44. Ronan had not repaired the splintered wood from his first violent intrusion. It hung crookedly on a single rusted hinge, refusing to close completely. I stepped into the freezing cell. The lumpy, damp mattress of my narrow cot offered absolutely no warmth. I lay down on top of the scratchy woolen blanket. I did not curl into a ball to conserve body heat. I simply lay flat on my back, staring up into the pitch-black ceiling. My breathing was shallow, perfectly regulated, completely empty. I was a corpse resting in a stone tomb. Above me, the castle should have settled into the quiet luxury of the royal night. The Alpha King possessed a bed of imported goose down, draped in heavy velvet, heated by a massive roaring hearth of fragrant pine. Instead, the slow, dragging sound of heavy boots echoed down the spiraling stone stairs. He was not stalking. He was not hunting. The footfalls were utterly devoid of energy. They were the agonizing, heavy steps of a man walking to his own execution. The scent of decaying cedar and sour, exhausted ozone rolled down the drafty corridor, pooling under the broken crack of my door like a toxic fog. He had abandoned his crown. He had abandoned the sky. He had descended into the lightless, freezing earth. The heavy footfalls stopped directly outside my room. He did not touch the twisted brass handle. He did not speak. The sound of thick, expensive fabric sliding against the rough limestone wall echoed in the dead silence. A heavy, bone-rattling thud shook the floorboards. Ronan had collapsed against the wall. The mighty Alpha King, the apex predator of the Western Territories, had folded his massive frame onto the filthy, freezing stone floor of the servants' corridor. He drew his knees up to his massive chest. He pressed his broad back flat against the splintered, rotting wood of my broken door. The subtext of his physical submission was absolute. He was a guard dog, a broken, whimpering beast chaining himself to the outside of a cage that I had locked from the inside. The freezing draft of the basement seeped through the cracks, biting viciously at the damp air. It was a cold that settled deep into the joints, the kind of damp rot that sickened the lower caste omegas every winter. Ronan was wearing nothing but a thin cotton undershirt and his ruined trousers. The ambient cold was brutal. I could hear his teeth chattering. A violent, irrepressible shiver rattled his massive frame, vibrating through the thin wood of the door and traveling across the floorboards directly to my cot. He was freezing. He did not move. He did not seek a heavy fur blanket. He leaned his head back against the wood. His breathing was ragged, uneven, completely desperate. He was listening. He was obsessively, frantically straining his hypersensitive acoustic hearing to catch the microscopic sound of my lungs expanding. The mate bond was completely dead. He could no longer feel my life force humming in his mind like he used to. The absolute terror of my silence was destroying his sanity. He needed auditory proof that I had not simply stopped breathing in the dark. He needed to hear my heart beating. I lay perfectly still. I slowed my breathing. I drew the freezing air into my lungs at an agonizingly slow pace. Inhale. A long, agonizing pause. Exhale. Outside the door, his panic spiked instantly. The scent of ozone flared sharply. I heard the desperate, frantic scraping of his large hands pressing flat against the wood. He held his own breath. He was terrified that the sound of his own violently shivering body was drowning out the faint rustle of my chest. He pressed his ear hard against the splinters. His silent, desperate plea screamed through the rotting cedar scent. He just needed me to breathe. I let out a slow, mechanical exhale. A harsh, wet, shuddering sigh of pure relief instantly echoed from the hallway. He slumped heavier against the door. He matched his breathing perfectly to mine. When I inhaled, he inhaled. When I exhaled, he exhaled. He was artificially tethering his physical survival to my bodily functions, desperately simulating a bond that no longer existed. He sat in the freezing, damp dirt, guarding a hollow shell, completely content to simply exist in the exact same miserable darkness that I did. Hours crawled by. The frost in my basement room thickened. Suddenly, the soft, hesitant scuff of a leather slipper echoed from the far end of the long corridor. A night shift laundering omega, carrying a heavy basket of wet rags. The sweet, timid scent of fear drifted softly down the hall. She was approaching. The immediate, violent transformation was terrifying. The shivering, broken king vanished. A massive, deafening snarl of pure, unadulterated feral bloodlust ripped through the corridor. The heavy wood of my door buckled inward as Ronan launched himself to his feet. The horrific metallic sound of his heavy claws fully extending and gouging violently into the stone wall. The midday meal in the grand dining pavilion was a suffocating affair. Hundreds of pack members crowded the long, scarred wooden tables. The air was thick with the heavy scent of roasted elk, spilled dark ale, and an underlying sour stench of collective anxiety. The warriors ate quickly. They kept their eyes firmly locked on their wooden trenchers. No one dared to laugh loudly. No one dared to raise an iron cup in a toast. The high table, carved from massive blocks of dark oak, sat on a raised dais at the far end of the hall. Ronan sat in the center seat. He did not eat. He stared blankly at the massive iron doors at the opposite end of the pavilion. His dark cedar scent was a heavy suffocating smog that coiled around the rafters like a venomous snake preparing to strike. I moved through the narrow aisles between the crowded tables. My canvas apron was heavy with soapy water. I dragged a massive wooden bucket behind me. My ruined hands grasped a coarse rag. I was tasked with immediately cleaning any spills before the hot grease could permanently stain the ancient flagstones. I operated in a bubble of complete freezing isolation. The pack members flinched away as I passed. They pulled their heavy leather boots tightly under the benches, terrified of accidentally brushing against the hem of my coarse skirt. They treated me like a walking explosive. But old habits, ingrained by years of unchecked arrogance, die very hard. Garrett was a senior warrior, a massive, heavily scarred wolf who had spent the last 5 years openly mocking my quiet voice. He sat near the end of a long table, tearing the last strips of meat from a heavy bone. He was deep in a hushed conversation with his lieutenant, distracted by a tactical map unrolled on the wood. He finished his meal. Without looking, driven by years of treating me like invisible refuse, he carelessly tossed his greasy wooden trencher and the gnawed bone directly over his shoulder. It hit the stone floor inches from my raw, unbandaged hands. Thick hot grease splattered across my coarse apron and soaked into the toe of my thin leather shoe. The trencher clattered loudly, spinning on the floor before coming to a halt. The sound was not particularly loud, but in the tense, suffocating atmosphere of the pavilion, it sounded like a cannon firing. The hushed conversations at the surrounding tables died instantly. A terrifying, absolute silence crashed down over the hundreds of wolves. No one moved. No one breathed. Every single pair of eyes slowly, agonizingly turned toward the raised dais. Ronan was no longer sitting. He had moved so fast that the heavy oak chair behind him was still rocking on its back legs. His dark cedar scent vanished entirely. It was instantly replaced by the terrifying metallic stench of pure lethal bloodlust. It tasted like copper coins and lightning on the back of the tongue. The air pressure in the enormous hall plummeted violently. Garrett turned around, a dismissive sneer already forming on his lips. The sneer froze. The blood drained completely from his weathered face. He realized his catastrophic mistake. Ronan did not roar. He did not issue a challenge. He simply bypassed the stone steps of the dais entirely. He vaulted over the high table, his heavy boots crashing onto the floorboards with a deafening boom. He crossed the massive length of the dining pavilion in 3 terrifying predatory strides. Garrett scrambled backward over the wooden bench. He tried to bare his throat in immediate submission. It was far too late. Ronan reached out. He gripped Garrett by the thick leather collar of his armor. He lifted the 200-pound warrior completely off his feet with a single brutal jerk. The silence in the hall was broken only by Garrett's choked panic gasps. Ronan hurled him downward. Garrett's face slammed violently into the heavy oak dining table. The thick wood splintered perfectly in half under the catastrophic impact. Food, ale, and shattered wood rained down upon the flagstone. Ronan dropped his knee directly onto the center of Garrett's spine. The wet, terrifying crack of breaking bone echoed off the vaulted ceiling. Ronan grabbed a fistful of Garrett's hair. He dragged the warrior's bleeding face across the rough flagstones, hauling him directly toward the greasy trencher on the floor. He shoved Garrett's face into the spilled grease. He held him down in the filth. The message was absolute. It was barbaric. The Alpha King was permanently rewiring the social hierarchy through pure, unadulterated terror. The pack watched in paralyzed horror. The mighty rational king had completely lost his mind over a silent, broken scullery maid. He was violently punishing the exact same behavior he had previously allowed, trying desperately to rewrite history with broken teeth and spilled blood. Ronan stood up. His massive chest heaved. His hands were coated in Garrett's blood. The lethal ozone scent slowly receded, replaced instantly by the desperate rotting cedar. He turned slowly toward me. He looked at me with wide, frantic eyes. His chest shuddered. He was silently screaming for my validation. He wanted me to see that he was protecting me now. He wanted me to recognize his violent, pathetic groveling. He was begging for a nod. A single soft look of gratitude. I looked at the bleeding, unconscious warrior groaning in the grease. I looked at the splintered wood. It was a massive mess. I did not meet the king's desperate eyes. I simply dropped to my knees on the cold flagstones. I plunged my ruined raw hands into the bucket of freezing water. I pulled out my coarse rag. I crawled forward, ignoring the Alpha King towering over me, and began to rhythmically wipe Garrett's fresh blood off the stone. Scrape. Scrape. Wipe. Ronan let out a soft broken whimper, stumbling backward as if I had driven a blade directly into his stomach. He retreated slowly toward the massive iron doors, his eyes completely hollowed out. But as he turned the heavy iron handle, the distinct warm scent of fresh wild root broth drifted out from the kitchens, planting a sudden dangerous seed in the dead air. The deep shadows of the lower laundry corridor offered a brief, freezing reprieve. I sat on a splintered wooden stool, my wet coarse skirt plastered heavily against my shivering calves. The skin of my knuckles throbbed with a dull, rhythmic burning after hours of scrubbing warrior blood from the pavilion stones. My world was entirely reduced to the freezing draft blowing down from the iron street grate above. Then the draft shifted. The suffocating dampness of the corridor parted, sliced open by a sudden, staggering wave of heat. The scent arrived first. It was not the metallic tang of ozone or the rotting decay of panic. It was the rich, savory aroma of slow-roasted bone marrow, wild roots, and fresh thyme. A scent of absolute, nurturing warmth. Ronan stepped silently out of the heavy gloom. He moved with agonizing care, terrified that the slightest sudden motion would shatter the fragile air between us. His massive frame was hunched forward, curling protectively around a small, glazed ceramic bowl held in his battle-scarred hands. Thick curls of fragrant steam drifted upward, carrying the warmth directly to my freezing face. He stopped 3 paces away. He slowly lowered his massive body until his knees rested on the damp, filthy flagstones. He held the bowl out toward me. His hands were shaking violently. The dark, savory broth sloshed dangerously close to the ceramic rim, threatening to spill over his knuckles. He did not issue a command. He did not beg. He simply offered sustenance, his chest rising and falling in shallow, frantic bursts. I looked down at the steaming ceramic. The gnawing ache of an empty stomach, previously buried beneath the numbness of my severed bond, twisted sharply in my abdomen. I had eaten nothing but hard, stale crusts for weeks. I raised my heavy, stiff arms. My raw, unbandaged hands trembled slightly from sheer physical exhaustion as I reached out. I wrapped my fingers around the base of the bowl. My freezing, ruined knuckles brushed directly against the burning hot skin of his massive hand. The contrast was violent. His flesh felt like a furnace against my ice. The physical contact was microscopic, lasting only a fraction of a second, but the biological reaction was instantaneous. The dormant, heavy mass of empathic energy coiled deep within my chest twitched. It was an involuntary, reflexive response to the sudden influx of extreme heat against my frozen skin. For a single, fleeting heartbeat, the impenetrable wall of frost surrounding my aura cracked. A faint, ghostly wisp of warm, sweet lavender leaked out into the cold, damp air. Ronan violently inhaled. A harsh, ragged gasp tore through his chest, sounding exactly like a drowning man breaking the surface of the water. His sunken, bloodshot eyes widened to an impossible degree. The rotting, sickly stench of his despair vanished entirely, eradicated in a blinding flash of pure, intoxicating cedar. The scent bloomed wildly, filling the corridor with the rich, powerful aroma of an alpha who believed he had just resurrected his dead mate. His entire body vibrated with a sudden, overwhelming surge of unadulterated hope. He stared at my face, a desperate, wet smile trembling on the edge of his lips. He thought he had found the key. He believed the wall was falling. He thought his violent devotion had finally reached the buried warmth of my soul. I pulled the ceramic bowl from his hands. I brought the heated rim slowly toward my face, letting the steam wash over my cracked lip. I did not look at the blinding, frantic joy illuminating his sunken eyes. I stared directly into the dark, simmering liquid, preparing to swallow. His heart hammered a frantic, victorious rhythm against his ribs, a deafening drumbeat completely blind to the catastrophic blade hovering directly over his fragile chest. The broth was rich. It tasted of roasted marrow, wild thyme, and the heavy, undeniable salt of desperate salvation. I tilted the ceramic bowl back, letting the thick, scalding liquid coat my raw throat. The warmth spread downward, blooming violently against the freezing void in my chest. It was a temporary physical comfort, a fleeting illusion of safety in a body that had long ago accepted its own spiritual death. I swallowed the last mouthful. The dark liquid vanished, leaving nothing but the damp ceramic and the overwhelming, suffocating pressure of his expectant gaze. Ronan knelt before me in the freezing mud of the corridor. His massive chest expanded and contracted with rapid, joyous breaths. The scent of dark cedar and blooming ozone was completely intoxicating. It was the scent of a king reclaiming his crown, a male wolf victorious after a brutal, agonizing hunt. He leaned closer. His battle-scarred hands twitched violently, hovering mere inches from my damp, coarse linen skirt. He wanted to touch me. He desperately wanted to wrap his massive arms around my waist, to bury his face in the crook of my neck, to inhale the blooming lavender he was absolutely certain was about to return. He was waiting for my eyes to soften. He was waiting for the ice to shatter. The microscopic fissure in my empathic shield slammed shut. The faint, ghostly wisp of lavender vanished instantly, brutally snuffed out by the absolute, crushing weight of my apathy. The frost returned, thicker and colder than before, coating my aura in a solid, impenetrable sheet of dead ash. I lowered the empty bowl. I did not cradle it against my chest. I held it out by the very edge, my raw, unbandaged fingers perfectly rigid. He stared at the ceramic. The victorious, frantic smile trembling on his lips faltered. The golden ring of his inner wolf flickered in his bloodshot eyes, suddenly confused by the abrupt, violent drop in atmospheric pressure. He slowly raised his shaking hands and took the empty bowl. I stepped back. The coarse, stiff fabric of my wet apron scraped harshly against the damp stone. I placed my right foot carefully behind my left. I lowered my gaze, fixing my eyes firmly on the scuffed steel toe of his heavy leather boot. I bent my knees. I dropped into a flawless, deeply practiced curtsy. It was the exact angle of respect demanded by the registry. A gesture of absolute, undeniable subservience. My king. The two words were completely hollow. They contained no warmth, no spite, no hidden edge of resentment. They were the mechanical, dead syllables of a lower-caste servant addressing her absolute monarch. The grand pavilion is clean. With your permission, I will proceed to the western stables. The stalls require mucking. The silence that followed was not just heavy. It was apocalyptic. The blooming, victorious cedar scent curdled in the air. It did not just rot, it violently imploded. The smell of burning ozone and sickly, metallic bough rushed into the freezing corridor, choking the last remnants of warmth. Ronan did not stand. He remained frozen on his knees, gripping the empty ceramic bowl so tightly that the thick clay suddenly fractured. A sharp, cracking sound echoed in the dark as the bowl shattered into jagged pieces in his bare hands. Shards of ceramic bit deeply into his palms, drawing fresh, dark blood. He did not flinch. He did not feel it. His massive shoulders collapsed inward as if his spine had been surgically removed. The blinding light in his eyes extinguished entirely, leaving behind two hollow, black pits of total psychological annihilation. He had touched the glorious summit of redemption, only to be thrown violently back down into the deepest, darkest abyss of my indifference. The false hope was a lethal poison, and he had swallowed every drop. He let out a low, ragged, wet gasp, folding his torso forward until his forehead hit the damp stone floor directly at my feet. His blood mingled with the muddy puddle. I did not wait for his dismissal. I turned my back on the weeping Alpha King and walked deeper into the freezing shadows, entirely unaffected by the sound of his heart shattering behind me. Far above, completely cutting through the muffled, pathetic sounds of his sobbing, the heavy iron bell of the northern watchtower began to toll frantically in the cold night air. The frantic, booming strikes signaled a perimeter breach. The exact date of my previous death had finally arrived. The northern watchtower bell did not just ring, it screamed. The massive iron clapper violently struck the brass, sending rhythmic, concussive shockwaves down through the ancient masonry of the castle. Zhong, 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 a frantic, terrifying cadence designed to wake the dead and summon the living to war. I stood perfectly still in the freezing shadows of the laundry corridor. The sound vibrated against my ribcage. I knew exactly what it meant. I knew the exact date, the 23rd of the autumn cycle, the exact hour, the exact alignment of the bruised, heavy clouds gathering over the northern perimeter. The timeline had caught up. My death had arrived for its scheduled appointment. The thick, damp air of the basement suddenly shifted. The heavy draft blowing down from the street grates carried a new, terrifying scent. It was not the crisp scent of incoming rain. It was the rancid, suffocating stench of matted black fur, yellow decay, and rabid, unadulterated bloodlust. The rogue army had breached the outer timberline. Panic erupted in the floors above me. The muffled, heavy thud of hundreds of leather boots scrambling across the marble corridors echoed like distant thunder. Warriors shouting frantic tactical commands. The high, sharp whimpers of terrified children being herded into the fortified inner sanctums. The scent of raw, sharp terror bled into the ventilation shafts, mixing with the sickening aroma of the approaching rogues. I did not scramble. I did not hide. I looked down at the coarse, stiff fabric of my apron. I untied the heavy canvas strings at my waist. I let the wet, grease-stained garment fall to the damp stone floor. It landed with a soft, heavy slap. I was not a scullery maid today. I was a biological weapon. I turned away from the shattered remnants of the Alpha King weeping in the dirt behind me. I began to walk toward the spiraling stone staircase leading to the surface. The ascent was chaotic. The grand halls were a blur of frantic, terrified motion. Armed wolves sprinted past me, their faces pale, their eyes wide with the realization that the perimeter had collapsed entirely too fast. They smelled of cold sweat and sharp adrenaline. None of them noticed the hollow, barefoot Omega walking steadily against the tide of panic. They were running away from the main iron gates. I was walking directly toward them. The massive, intricate stained glass windows of the grand entrance hall cast twisted, blood-red shadows across the polished floor. The sky outside had mutated into that exact, sickly shade of bruised violet and bleeding crimson. The memory overlapping seamlessly with reality. Every step I took felt like walking through thick, invisible water. My pulse remained perfectly, terrifyingly steady. Deep within my chest, the dormant, heavy mass of my empathic shielding scent began to uncoil. The biological failsafe recognized the massive influx of pack terror. The microscopic locks on my olfactory glands trembled, preparing to rip open and absorb the catastrophic emotional weight of the massacre. I pushed open the heavy wooden side doors and stepped out into the main courtyard. The cold autumn wind whipped violently against my thin, coarse gray dress. The ground beneath my bare feet was a churning sea of wet, freezing mud. The massive wrought iron front gates of the compound groaned agonizingly under a colossal external weight. The screech of bending metal was deafening. The rogue army was slamming themselves against the iron. A mindless tide of feral destruction desperate to feast on the terrified pack huddled behind the stone walls. The heavy wooden crossbeams reinforcing the gates began to splinter. Crack! Crack! A jagged spear of dark would snap violently in half. The hinges screamed. I walked to the exact dead center of the muddy courtyard. The exact patch of earth where my spine had been snapped 1 year ago. I stood perfectly straight. I closed my eyes. I prepared to drop my mental barriers. I prepared to flood my lungs with the poisoned air, to drag their rabid frenzy into my own bloodstream, and to die in the mud a second time. I drew in a massive, final breath. The iron gates exploded inward with a catastrophic roar. A tidal wave of rabid, monstrous wolves poured through the shattered metal. But before my empathic aura could flare outward, a massive, suffocating wave of dark cedar and burning ozone slammed into my back. The biological failsafe violently engaged. The microscopic barriers within my olfactory glands ripped open. My scent, the frozen dead ash, mutated instantly into a supermassive, invisible vortex. I inhaled. The thick, poisonous air of the courtyard rushed into my lungs. The rabid, mindless bloodlust of the rogue army slammed into my nervous system like a runaway freight train. My knees buckled. I hit the freezing mud. The sheer volume of negative emotional energy overloaded my synapses. It was 100 lightning bolts surging through fragile glass veins. Blood immediately poured freely from my nose, dripping down my chin in thick, warm streams. My vision blurred into a chaotic smear of violent colors. The leading rogues slowed, their rabid frenzy instantly neutralized by the paralyzing shock of my empathic weight. I was dragging their aggression into my own fragile body, suffocating the threat at the cost of my own organs. I was dying. Again, a massive, scarred rogue with half a missing ear and decaying yellow teeth fought through the empathic sludge. The exact same beast. The exact same jagged claws. It lunged. I closed my eyes. I braced for the horrific, wet crunch of my spine snapping. It never came. A colossal shadow eclipsed the sickly violet sky. Ronan did not stand on the pristine marble balcony. He did not watch. He collided with the massive rogue midair with the concussive force of a falling meteor. The sound of shattering bone and tearing flesh was deafening. Ronan bore the beast into the mud. He did not shift into his wolf form. He fought entirely in his human skin, driven by a feral, suicidal madness that completely bypassed rational tactics. His massive hands gripped the rogue's jaws. He ripped the beast's throat open with raw, brute strength. Black blood sprayed across the freezing mud. He stood up. His chest heaved. The scent of burning ozone and dark cedar was completely overpowering, thick with pure, unadulterated territorial fury. He stepped backward, positioning his massive frame directly over my kneeling body. He straddled me. He became a living, breathing fortress of muscle and bone. The second wave of rogues hit. Teeth snapped. Claws tore. Blood rained down. I knelt in the mud beneath him, my eyes locked open, trapped in the agonizing paralysis of my empathic shielding scent. I watched him take the damage. He did not dodge. He did not protect his own vital organs. He threw his arms wide, intentionally catching the lethal strikes meant for my frail body. A jagged set of claws laid his left thigh open to the bone. He did not scream. A set of rotting teeth clamped down on his broad shoulder. He simply twisted, snapping the rogue's neck with a violent jerk, accepting the massive loss of his own flesh. He was rewriting history with his own blood. He was actively, desperately atoning for his past apathy by allowing himself to be torn apart in the exact spot I had died. The hot, rich crimson of his alpha blood dripped down from his ruined torso, splashing onto my coarse gray dress. It was burning hot. It soaked through the stiff linen, warming my freezing skin. My nervous system screamed. The catastrophic weight of 100 terrorized minds poured into the fragile vessel of my body, expanding against my ribs until I thought my chest would split open in a spray of bone and marrow. The empathic overload was blinding. My hands dug violently into the mud. The sheer, agonizing pain of the psychic drain threatened to pull me under. But every time my consciousness began to slip into the dark, a fresh drop of Ronan's blood hit my cheek, a violent, physical anchor tying me to the waking world. The courtyard was a slaughterhouse. The rogues were dying, their minds crushed by my empathic weight, their bodies shredded by the Alpha King standing over me. But there were too many. A massive, pitch-black rogue, twice the size of the others, bypassed Ronan's blind spot. It ignored the Alpha entirely. Its yellow eyes locked directly onto my throat, the source of the empathic gravity. It lunged. Ronan saw it a fraction of a second too late. He could not counterattack. He could only intercept. He threw his massive, bleeding chest directly into the path of the beast's open jaws. The wet, horrific sound of jagged teeth sinking deep into his ribcage echoed across the courtyard. The rogue's momentum carried them both backward. Ronan collapsed into the mud, his breathing instantly replaced by a wet, gargling choke. The scent of dark cedar abruptly vanished, completely replaced by the overwhelming stench of arterial blood. I knelt in the quiet, absolute ruin of the courtyard, my shielding scent suddenly, violently snapping shut. The rogue's massive carcass was a heavy, lifeless weight pinning Ronan to the freezing mud. His breath was a horrific, bubbling rattle. The empathic static that had flooded my veins for the past 10 minutes vanished entirely, leaving behind a sharp, ringing silence. My vision slowly cleared. The courtyard was a gruesome graveyard of matted black fur and ruined stone. I remained on my knees. My coarse gray dress was completely saturated with the king's blood. It was heavy. It clung to my icy skin, a suffocating, physical manifestation of his brutal sacrifice. The heavy, iron-reinforced doors of the great hall slowly creaked open. The immediate threat was dead. The surviving warriors, the trembling Omegas, and the 6 gray-haired elders of the High Council stepped cautiously out into the biting autumn wind. They stopped. The collective gasp of the pack sucked the remaining oxygen from the courtyard. They stared at the impossible, horrifying tableau. The mighty Alpha King, the untouchable sovereign. He was not standing victorious upon a mountain of his enemies. He was crushed into the filthy earth, his massive chest torn open, his life force spilling rapidly into the puddles of gray rainwater. And I, the nameless blank scullery maid, knelt quietly beside him, my face smeared with soot, mud, and his bright red blood. Garrett, his face still heavily bandaged from the dining hall incident, sprinted forward. The royal medics followed frantically on his heels, their hands full of white silk rolls and potent healing salves. They rushed toward the fallen king, their boots splashing violently in the puddles. A low, terrifying growl ripped through the bubbling blood in Ronan's throat. It was not a roar of dominance. It was a feral, desperate warning. He raised a violently trembling, ruined hand. He swiped blindly at the approaching medics, his claws extending just enough to force them to scramble backward in pure terror. He refused their aid. He refused the silk. He pushed the massive carcass of the dead rogue off his shredded chest. The wet, sickening sound of his broken ribs shifting made the closest council elder dry heave into the dirt. Ronan rolled onto his stomach. He dug his raw, blood-soaked fingers deep into the freezing mud. He did not try to stand. He could not stand. His left leg was laid open to the bone. His chest was a gaping, catastrophic wound. He dragged himself. The Alpha King planted his elbows into the mud and pulled his massive, broken body across the courtyard. The agonizing, wet friction of his torn torso dragging over the jagged cobblestones echoed in the absolute silence. A thick, dark trail of royal blood painted the earth behind him. He crawled. He crawled directly toward me. The pack watched in paralyzed, suffocating horror. The elders of the council stood frozen, their mouths hanging slightly open, their ancient laws entirely unequipped to process the visual destruction of their monarch. The scent of his dark cedar was almost gone. It was barely a whisper, completely drowned out by the thick, metallic stench of imminent death. He reached my knees. His shaking, blood-stained fingers weakly gripped the wet, coarse fabric of my gray skirt. He rested his heavy chin on the mud directly at my feet. He was struggling to keep his eyes open. The brilliant golden ring of his inner wolf was completely extinguished, leaving only the dark, terrified human eyes of a man desperately trying to outrun the clock. He coughed. A spray of bright crimson coated the toe of my thin, worn leather shoe. He forced his head up. He looked directly past me, staring at the high council gathered on the stone steps. His voice was a ruined, wet rasp. It was barely a whisper, yet it carried across the dead, frozen silence of the courtyard like a cracking whip. I, Ronan. Every warrior in the courtyard instinctively dropped to one knee at the sound of the formal oath. Alpha of the Western Reach, King of the Blood Moon. He choked. His broad chest convulsed violently. More blood spilled from his pale lips, soaking into the dirt. He tightened his weak grip on my muddy skirt, grounding his fading consciousness in the coarse fabric. I strip my crown. I sever my command. I surrender my throat. The collective shock of the pack was a physical, concussive wave. The High Council elder stepped forward, his ancient, withered hands shaking violently. An alpha does not surrender his command unless he is challenged and beaten in bloody combat. To voluntarily surrender it to a lower caste omega, a scullery maid sitting silently in the dirt, was a catastrophic violation of every known biological and political law. Ronan ignored the sputtering elder. He turned his ruined face back to me, his sunken, dying eyes locked onto my hollow, blank stare. He did not ask me to be his Luna. He did not ask me to put the gold silk back on. He did not even ask me to magically rebuild the shattered mate bond. The subtext of his broken, bleeding form was a desperate, singular plea from a completely broken man. Forgive me. The two words were the very last remnants of his oxygen. Just let me wash your hands. His fingers slipped limply from my skirt. His massive, heavy head dropped back down into the freezing mud with a soft, wet thud. The agonizing, wet rattle in his chest stopped entirely. The absolute silence that followed was entirely suffocating. The mighty Alpha King lay perfectly still in the dirt at my feet. The High Council elder looked at me. The surviving, kneeling warriors looked at me. The terrified royal medics looked at me. The ancient hierarchy was permanently broken. The crown was abandoned in the mud. The Alpha was gone. They were waiting for the scullery maid to issue the order to let him die, or to permit the medics to touch him. I stared down at his motionless, bleeding form. A single, freezing drop of rain fell from the sickly violet sky, landing directly on his pale, lifeless cheek. The rain began to fall in earnest. Heavy, freezing drops striking the bruised earth like tiny, sharp stones. They washed the thick crimson from his pale cheek, diluting it into a thin, pink stream that seeped into the dark soil. He was perfectly still. The catastrophic, wet rattle of his lungs had ceased. The courtyard was a tomb. Hundreds of wolves knelt in the mud, completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the broken hierarchy. They were waiting for me. They were waiting for the hollow, soulless Omega to either grant the royal medics permission to intervene, or to simply turn her back and let the king rot in the filth. The freezing void inside my chest remained entirely silent, but something at the very outer edge of the ice shifted. A microscopic, agonizing friction. I looked down at my ruined, raw hands. They were coated in soot, lye, and his drying blood. He had dragged himself across jagged cobblestones, his chest laid open to the bone, entirely surrendering his alpha command, just to beg for the right to wash my bleeding fingers. I slowly lowered myself back into the freezing mud. I did not issue a command. I did not speak to the trembling elder or the horrified warriors. My universe was once again entirely reduced to a single, immediate task. But this time, it was not the dirty floor. I reached out. My trembling, raw fingers brushed against the icy skin of his throat. His pulse was a ghost. A faint, irregular flutter beneath the bruised flesh, struggling desperately to keep the blood pumping to his starved brain. The physical contact sent a sudden shockwave straight up my arm. He was dying. The realization hit the frozen wall of my apathy, like an iron battering ram. I did not want him to die. I turned my head slightly toward the trembling royal medics. I did not need to speak. The absolute, heavy demand in my blank eyes was enough. They scrambled forward on their knees, pushing a heavy leather satchel of supplies across the mud. They dared not touch him. They understood the new, unspoken law of the pack. His life belonged entirely to the scullery maid. I reached into the satchel. I bypassed the iron sutures and the heavy bandages. I pulled out a fresh spool of the finest, softest white silk, the exact same eucalyptus-scented fabric he had ruined trying to bind my hands in the kitchen. I leaned over his broken chest. The damage was catastrophic. The rogue's teeth had torn through the muscle. I pressed the pristine white silk directly into the gaping wound. The fabric instantly saturated, turning a dark, heavy crimson. I applied pressure. The searing heat of his blood soaked my frozen fingers, seeping directly into the deep fissures of my cracked knuckles. I worked in absolute, terrifying silence. I wound the silk around his massive torso, pulling the fabric tight to stem the catastrophic bleeding. I moved with the meticulous, hollow precision of a servant, but the subtext of my actions was deafening in the quiet courtyard. I was binding his shattered chest. I was holding the pieces of his ruined body together. The rain plastered my coarse gray hair to my skull. Deep within my chest, the heavy, dormant mass of my empathic shielding scent began to change frequency. The impenetrable wall of frost surrounding my aura cracked. A distinct, audible snap echoing in the spiritual void. The scent leaked out slowly. It was incredibly faint. It lacked the vibrant, overwhelming warmth of my past life. But it was no longer dead ash. It was the scent of bruised lavender, slowly pushing its way up through a thick layer of frozen, hard earth. A tiny, fragile bud of warmth bleeding into the metallic, sour stench of the courtyard. Ronan's chest violently hitched. The microscopic hint of lavender hit his failing olfactory glands. Even hovering on the very brink of absolute death, his biological instincts recognized the shift. His hand, heavy and completely limp in the mud beside my knee, suddenly twitched. His thick, blood-stained fingers curled inward, weakly brushing against the coarse hem of my soaked apron. He let out a low, shuddering breath. The scent of ozone, completely extinguished moments ago, sparked faintly in the damp air. It smelled like a single, weak ember glowing in the center of a drenched hearth. I tied the final knot in the blood-soaked silk. I did not pull away. I kept my ruined, raw hands pressed firmly against his bound chest, feeling the weak, erratic thud of his failing heart beating directly against my palms. His dark eyelashes fluttered. They did not open, but his brow furrowed in a deep, agonizing grimace. A single, fresh tear leaked from the corner of his closed eye, cutting a clean path through the blood and mud on his face. He was tethering his fading soul directly to the warmth of my bleeding hands. Suddenly, a sharp, terrifying drop in the collective temperature of the courtyard sent a violent chill down my spine, and a deep, guttural snarl from the shadowed treeline confirmed the battle was not entirely over. The guttural snarl vibrated directly through the wet, blood-soaked cobblestones. A massive, mangled rogue detached itself from the deep shadows of the northern treeline. It had survived the initial slaughter. Its jaw hung at a sickening broken angle. It locked its single rabid yellow eye directly on my kneeling form. It dug its heavy claws into the mud, preparing for a final, lethal, desperate lunge. I did not flinch. I did not pull my hands away from Ronan's ruined, bleeding chest. I simply stared at the approaching beast, entirely hollow, perfectly prepared to accept the impact. A violent blur of gray and brown fur intercepted the beast before it could cross 5 paces. Garrett, the senior warrior, the exact same man Ronan had violently beaten into the dining hall flagstones. He slammed into the rogue with catastrophic, unadulterated force. He did not fight alone. The entire surviving pack, hundreds of wolves who had spent years mocking my quiet existence, erupted into a unified, terrifying frenzy. They descended upon the straggler like an avalanche of teeth and muscle. It was not a battle. It was a brutal, instantaneous execution. They did not look to the fallen alpha for permission. They swarmed forward, forming a massive, impenetrable, living wall of snarling fur around me and Ronan. The hierarchy of the Blood Moon Pack was permanently rewritten in the mud. They were not protecting their king. They were protecting their scullery maid. The heavy, iron-reinforced doors of the great hall banged loudly against the stone walls as the royal medics sprinted forward with a thick canvas stretcher. They dropped to their knees, their hands shaking violently as they carefully lifted Ronan's massive, broken body. I stood up. The wet, coarse fabric of my gray dress clung heavily to my freezing legs, entirely saturated with his blood. I walked beside the stretcher. I did not ask for permission. The pack parted silently, bowing their heads as I passed, creating a wide, respectful path through the carnage. We bypassed the destroyed Luna suite entirely. We descended into the quiet, sterile sanctuary of the Royal Infirmary. It was a vast, white stone room, smelling sharply of bitter yarrow, sweet eucalyptus, and clean linen. They transferred him to a heavy iron cot. The medics worked with frantic, terrified precision, cleaning the mud from his catastrophic wounds, binding his broken ribs with tight bands of fresh silk. When they were finished, they immediately backed away, pressing themselves against the far walls, leaving a wide perimeter around the bed. I dragged a heavy wooden stool to the bedside. The rough wood scraped loudly against the clean stone floor. I sat down. Ronan was unconscious, his massive chest rising and falling in shallow, agonizingly weak intervals. His skin was the color of old parchment. I reached out. I did not hesitate. I slid my raw, unbandaged hand, still stained heavily with soot and his dried blood, directly into his massive, limp palm. My ruined fingers laced through his. The physical contact was a sudden, brilliant spark in a pitch-black room. The heavy, dormant mass of empathic energy coiled deep within my chest violently hummed. The scent of bruised lavender, the fragile bud that had pushed through the frost in the courtyard, suddenly thickened. It curled through the sterile air of the infirmary, reaching out, searching the cold space. His chest hitched. A long, rattling breath pulled my scent deep into his failing lungs. The dark cedar answered. It was incredibly weak. It was entirely stripped of the arrogant, suffocating ozone that had defined his past life. It smelled like ancient, weathered wood warmed by a very soft, hesitant sunrise. The two scents met in the narrow space over the white sheets. They did not clash. They tangled. A sudden, sharp pressure bloomed directly behind my eyes. The silent, freezing void in my mind vibrated. The mind link. It was not the solid, suffocating golden tether of the past. It was a thin, fragile thread of pure, trembling silver. It reached across the spiritual darkness and gently, hesitantly tapped against the edge of my consciousness. It was asking for permission. It was a terrifying, vulnerable question. I did not slam the door shut. I dropped my mental shield. I let the silver thread connect. The flood of emotion was instantaneous. It contained absolutely no word. There was no alpha command. There was no arrogant demand for my return. It was a tidal wave of pure, crushing, agonizing remorse. I felt the exact, visceral physical weight of his shattered ego. I felt the blinding, suffocating terror he experienced when he found me scrubbing his boots. I felt the absolute, complete surrender of his soul. His physical eyes remained closed, but his grip on my hand tightened with a sudden, desperate strength. He slowly turned his heavy head on the white pillow. He pressed his face directly into my raw, ruined knuckles. He inhaled deeply, his lips brushing against the deep fissures in my skin. A silent, agonizing apology pressed directly into my torn flesh. The ice around my heart did not shatter violently. It melted, a slow, agonizingly beautiful thaw that seeped deep into my aching joints. The phantom pain of my past death, the lingering terror of the mud and the teeth, began to wash away in the warm, quiet current of his absolute surrender. I shifted my weight on the rough wooden stool. I leaned forward, resting my forehead gently against the very edge of the white mattress. The heavy iron door of the infirmary groaned softly on its hinges. The High Elder stepped quietly into the sterile room. He held Ronan's discarded, heavy gold crown in his trembling, ancient hands, his eyes darting nervously between the sleeping king and the scullery maid holding his heart. The iron key turned violently in the lock of door 44. The loud, decisive click echoed down the lightless servants' corridor. I stood on the bottom landing. Ronan stood directly beside me. He leaned on a carved oak cane, his left leg stiffened by the horrific rogue bite. The damp basement was officially condemned. The heavy oak door was sealed shut with thick iron bracket. The air smelled of fresh mortar and absolute closure. He reached out and gently took the key from my scarred fingers. He walked to the floor grate and dropped the key down the castle's ancient sewer drain. A distant, hollow splash. The dark was locked away forever. The High Council gathered in the rebuilt pavilion. The long, splintering oak tables were replaced by circular tables carved from warm cedar. There was no head table. There was no raised dais elevating the alpha above his people. Ronan sat firmly beside me, his massive shoulder pressing warmly against mine, establishing an unbreakable front. The heavy gold crown sat discarded in the center of the table, entirely untouched. The High Elder, his ancient hands trembling with a newfound reverence, pushed a thick, heavy roll of parchment toward us. The new laws of the pack. I picked up the raven feather quill. My knuckles, healed now into pale, thick silver scars, gripped the stem with a quiet, steady strength. The scent of rotting ozone was permanently gone, entirely replaced by the steady, deep hum of ancient forest cedar and my own rich, blooming lavender. I wrote the decrees. The Alpha King's command was no longer absolute. The Omega caste was dissolved. No wolf would ever be forced to scrub the freezing flagstones until their hands bled. The physical labor of the castle would be rotated evenly through the ranks of the warriors, a daily reminder that humility is the foundation of true strength. I signed my name. Maeve. Just Maeve. Ronan signed directly beneath it. His large hand did not tremble. His dark eyes watched the wet ink dry. The subtext was a permanent, glorious surrender. He was walking beside a survivor. That evening, the massive hearth in our private suite roared with a towering, fragrant pine fire. The twisted, broken vanity mirror had been swept away. The room was completely stripped of its suffocating silk and arrogant luxury. It was simple, warm, grounded. I stood perfectly still before the dancing flames. I held the coarse, stiff, bristled scrub brush in my right hand. The rough wood was permanently stained with dark lye and the faded brown of my own dried blood. I tossed it directly into the fire. The dry bristles caught the flame instantly. They hissed and popped violently, twisting into blackened curls before crumbling into soft gray ash. The harsh smell of burning lye was rapidly swallowed by the sweet, heavy smoke of the pine sap. Ronan stepped out of the shadows. He wrapped his massive, heavily scarred arms around my waist from behind. He moved with an agonizing, meticulous care, his broad chest pressing softly against my spine. The healing, jagged scars on his ribs were thick and ridged beneath his thin cotton shirt. He buried his face deep into the crook of my neck. He inhaled deeply. A long, shuddering sigh of pure, unadulterated peace vibrated against my collarbone. The silver thread in my mind hummed a quiet, beautiful rhythm. The desperate, frantic groveling was over. The agonizingly slow process of genuine healing had finally begun. I rested my scarred hands directly over his massive forearms. A new, entirely different heartbeat fluttered faintly directly beneath my palms. It was not my steady pulse. It was not his heavy, booming rhythm. It was the microscopic, rapid drumbeat of a tiny, fragile life taking root deep within my womb. The final proof that the dead earth had fully thawed. Ronan felt it. The sudden, sharp intake of his breath rustled my hair. He did not boast. He did not roar his territorial triumph to the night sky. He simply wept, a silent, joyous stream of warm tears, soaking into the collar of my soft cotton dress. We stood together in the glowing firelight. The mighty Alpha King, stripped of his suffocating arrogance, and the scullery maid, stripped of her paralyzing silence. The crushing weight of the past was entirely burned away. The pack was quiet. The borders were secure. The dark cedar and the sweet, blooming lavender tangled perfectly in the warm air, rising up toward the snow-capped mountains. A new dawn breaking over a completely rewritten world. Her story has come to an end. Please like, subscribe, and comment your thoughts.